All right, guys, welcome back. Thursday. Today we are going to do a little bit more reading in the book, and after you are done reading the book, today you're not going to have any Socrative questions. You're going to watch a video, and you're going to have questions about that video. Okay. All right. So again, we kind of see that Luke's life is getting worse and worse for him. A lot of his privileges that he had are taken away. Can no longer go outside, and now he can't even sit with his family to eat. Okay, so he's kind of restricted on what he's doing. We find out he's the reasoning is because he's a third child. All right, chapter 5. Luke ate every meal after that on the bottom step. It became a habit, but a hated one. He had never noticed before, but Mother often spoke too softly to be heard from any distance, and Matthew and Mark always made their nasty comments under her breath. So they would start laughing, often at Luke's expense, and he couldn't even defend himself because he didn't know what they had said. He couldn't even hear Mother saying, "Now be nice, boys," after a week or two. A lot of the time, he didn't even try to listen to the rest of the family's conversation. But even he was curious the hot July day when the letter arrived about the pigs. Matthew brought the mail in that day from the mailbox at the crossroads a mile away. Luke had never seen them, of course, but Matthew and Mark had told him there were 3 mailboxes there, one for each of the families that lived on their road. Usually, the gardener's mail was just bills or thin envelopes carrying curt orders from the government about how much corn to plant, which fertilizer to use, and where to take their crop when it was harvested. A letter from a relative was a cause to celebrate, and Mother always dropped whatever she was doing and sat down to open it with trembling hands, calling out in intervals, "Oh, Aunt Effie's in the hospital again," or "Elizabeth's going to marry that fellow after all." Luke almost felt he knew his relatives, though they lived hundreds of miles away. Of course, they didn't even know he existed. The letters, Mother wrote back painstakingly, late at night when she'd saved up enough money for a stamp, contained plenty of news of Matthew and Mark, but never once had mentioned Luke's name. All right, so you can obviously tell that they don't really have any money. Again, stamps are pretty cheap, and she can't even write a letter back unless she has money for a stamp. This letter was as thick as some from Luke's grandmother, but it bore an official seal, and the return address was embossed: Department of Human Habitation, Environmental Standards Division. Matthew held the letter at arm's length, the way Luke had seen him hold dead baby pigs when they had to be carried out of the barn. Dad looked worried the minute he saw the letter in Matthew's hand. Matthew put the letter down beside Dad's silverware. Dad sighed. "Can't be anything but bad news," Dad said. "No use ruining a good meal. I can wait." He went back to eating chicken and dumplings. Only after his last belch did he turn to the envelope over a run and run a dirt-rimmed fingernail under the flap. He unfolded the letter. "It has come to our attention," he read aloud. "Well, so far as I understand it." Then he read silently for a while, calling out at intervals, "Mother, what's soulful in? Where's that dictionary? Matthew, look up reciprocity." Finally, he threw down the whole thick packet, and he proclaimed, "They're making us get rid of our hogs." And again, hogs is another name for a pig. "What?" Matthew asked, more serious than Mark. He had talked for as long as anyone could remember about. "When I get my own farm, it's going to be all hogs. I'll make the government let me do that somehow." Now he looked at Dad over Dad's shoulder. "You mean they're going to make us sell a lot at one time? But we could build the herd back up." "Nope," Dad said. "Those people in them fancy new houses won't be able to stand the pig smell, so we can't raise hogs no more." He threw the letter at the center of the table for everyone to see. What did they expect building next to a farm? From his seat on the stairs, Luke had told himself, back from going to edge the letter out of the chicken gravy and look at it himself. "They can't do that, can they?" he asked. Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. Luke felt like a fool for asking as soon as the words left his mouth. For once he was glad of his hiding place. Mother twisted a dish rag in her hand. "The hogs are our bread and butter," she said. Now, this is an expression, bread and butter. If something's your bread and butter, it basically means that that's how you make your living. With grain prices the way they are, what are we going to live on? Dad just looked at her. After a moment, so did Matthew and Mark. Luke didn't know why. So there's a clue here, the fact that they're all looking at her. It's obvious that they're kind of expecting the mom's going to have to do something. Chapter 6. The tax bill arrived 2 weeks later. That day, the day that Dad, Matthew, and Mark loaded the hogs onto a livestock trailer, they took them all away. Most were going to the slaughterhouse. The ones too young and too small to bring in a decent price were going to an auction for feeder pigs. Luke watched through the vent at the front of the house as Dad drove by the pickup with each load. Matthew and Mark sat in the back of the pickup, making sure the trailer stayed hitched right. Even 3 stories up, Luke could see Matthew's hangdog expression. So obviously Matthew's upset because he wanted to raise pigs. When the three of them came into the house for dinner after washing the last of the hog smell off their hands in the mudroom, Dad handed Mother the tax bill without comment. She put down the wooden spoon she'd be using to stir the stew and she unfolded the letter. Then she dropped it. Why, that's. She seemed to be doing the math in her head as she bent to retrieve it. That's 3 times what it usually is. There must be a mistake. Dad shook his head grimly. No mistake. I talked to the Williger at the auction. The Willigers were the nearest neighbors, with a house 3 miles down the road. Luke always pictured them with monster scales and fierce claws because of the number of times he'd been told, "You don't want the Willigers to see you." Dad went on, "Well, Williger says they raised everybody's taxes because of those fancy houses. Makes our land worth more." "Isn't that good?" Luke asked eagerly. It was strange. He should hate these new houses for replacing his woods and forcing him to stay indoors, but he half fallen in love with them, having watched every foundation poured, every wooden skeleton of walls and roofs raised to the sky. They were his main entertainment, aside from talking to Mother when she came upstairs by what she called my Luke breaks. Sometimes she pretended his room needed cleaning as badly as the bread needed baking or the garden needed weeding. Sometimes she just sat and talked. Dad was shaking his head in disgust over Luke's question. "No, it's only good if we're selling it. We ain't. All it means for us is the government thinks they can get more money from us." Matthew was slumped in his chair at the table. "How are we going to pay?" he asked. "That's more than we get for all the hogs, and that was supposed to carry us for a long time." Dad didn't answer. Even Mark, who normally had a smart alecky comeback for everything, was stupefied. Mother had turned back to her stew. "I got my work permit today," she said softly. "Factory's hiring. If I get in on there, I can maybe get an advance on my paycheck." Luke's jaw dropped. "You can't go to work," he said. "Who will—" He wanted to say, "Who will stay with me? Who will I talk to all day when everyone's outside?" But it seemed too selfish. Luke looked around. No one else looked surprised by Mother's news. He shut his mouth. Chapter 7. By mid-September, Luke's days had fallen into a familiar pattern. He got up at dawn, just before dawn, for a chance to sit on the stairs and watch the rest of his family eat breakfast. They all rushed now. Mother had to be at the factory by 7. Dad was trying to get all the machinery in working order before harvest, and Matthew and Mark were back in school. Only Luke had time to linger over his undercooked bacon and dry toast. He didn't bother asking for butter because that meant someone would have to stand up and bring it to him, and all the while pretending for the sake of the open window they just forgot something upstairs. As soon as the rest of the family stomped out the door, Luke went back to his room and watched out the vents. First out the front to see Matthew and Mark climb on the school bus, then out the back where the new houses were practically finished. They were mansions, as large as the Garner's house and barn put together. They gleamed in the morning sunlight as through their walls were studded with precious jewels, for all Luke knew maybe they were. Hordes of workmen still arrived every morning, but almost all of them worked indoors now. They headed into their houses first thing, carrying rolls of carpet, stacks of drywall, cans of paint. Luke couldn't see much of them after that. He spent more time now watching a new kind of traffic. Expensive-looking cars driving slowly down the newly paved streets. Sometimes they pulled into a driveway and went into one of the houses, usually trailing a woman who appeared to be talking nonstop. It had taken Luke a while to figure out. He certainly hadn't dared ask anyone in his family, but he thought maybe the people were thinking about buying these houses. Once he realized that, he studied each potential neighbor carefully. He'd overheard Mother and Dad marveling that the people moving into the new houses were not just going to be city people, but barons. Barons were unbelievably rich, Luke knew. They had things ordinary people hadn't had in years. Luke wasn't sure how the barons had gotten rich, which when everybody else was poor, but Dad never said the word baron without a curse word or two in front of it. The people streaming through these houses did look different from anyone in Luke's family. They were mostly thin, beautiful women in form-fitting dresses and heavy-set men in what Luke's dad and brothers called sissy suits, shiny shoes and clean, dressy pants and jackets. Luke always felt a little embarrassed for them showing up like that. Or maybe he was embarrassed for his family that they never looked like any of these barons. Luke preferred it when the adults and children with them and he could concentrate on them. The smallest ones were as dressed as their parents with her hair bows and suspenders and other hee-haws Luke knew his parents would never buy. The older kids usually seemed to be wearing whatever they grabbed first out of their closet that morning. Though he knew no one would dare show up with 3 kids, he always counted 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. What if a family with just one kid moved in behind, and he sneaked into their house and pretended to be their second child? He could go to school, go to town, act like Matthew and Mark. What a joke, Luke living with barons. More likely he'd be shot for trespassing, or turned in. When he began thinking things like this, he always jumped down from his perch by the vent and grabbed a book from one of the dusty stacks by the eaves. Mother taught him to read and do math as much as she knew herself. "At least we have a few books for you," she often mumbled sadly when she left in the morning. He read all their books dozens of times, even the ones with titles like Diseases of the Porcine Species and Common Grasses of Our Countryside. His favorites were the handful of adventure books, the ones that Let him pretend that he was a knight fighting a dragon to rescue a kidnapped princess, or an explorer sailing on the high seas, holding tight to a mast while a hurricane raged about him. He liked to forget he was Luke Garner, third child hidden in the attic. Sometime around noon, he'd heard the door from the mudroom to the kitchen swing open, and he'd go down and eat at the same time as his dad. With Mother there was no homemade pies now, no mashed potatoes, no roasts that sent good smells through the house. Dad always made 4 sandwiches, checked to make sure no one could see him, then handed 2 of them to Luke in the stairwell. Dad never talked. He'd explain that he didn't want anyone overhearing him and wondering, but he did turn on the radio for the noon farm report, and there was usually a song or two after that before Dad silenced the radio and went outside to work again. When Dad left, Luke went back to his room to read or watch the houses again. At 6:30, Mother came home, and she always stopped in and said hi to Luke before rushing out to a day's work in a few hours before bedtime. Usually Matthew or Mark came to visit him too, but they could never stay long either. They had to help Dad before supper, then do their homework afterwards. Then, and they always had been nicest to Luke outdoors before the woods came down. To 3 of them had played kickball or football or spud in the backyard after school and chores. Matthew and Mark always fought about who had Luke on his team because even if Luke wasn't very good, 2 boys together always could beat the third. Now they played half-hearted games of checkers or cards with Luke, but Luke could tell that they'd rather be outside. So would he. He tried not to think about it. The best part of the day came at the end when Mother tucked him in. She'd be relaxed then. She'd stay for an hour asking him what he'd read all day or telling him stories about the factory. Then one night when she was telling how her plastic glove had gotten stuck in a chicken she degutted that day, Mother suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Mother?" Luke said. She answered with a snore. She'd fallen asleep sitting up. Luke studied her face, seeing lines of fatigue that hadn't been there before, noticing that her hair around her face now held as much gray as brown. "Mother?" he said again, gently shaking her arm. She jerked. "But I cleaned the chicken up." "Oh, I'm sorry, Luke. You need tucking in, don't you?" She fluffed his pillow and smoothed the sheet. Luke sat up. "That's okay, Mother. I'm getting too old for this anyway." He swallowed a lump in his throat. "I bet you weren't still tucking Matthew and Mark when they were 12. "No," she said quietly. "I don't need it either." "Okay," she said. She kissed his forehead anyhow, then turned out the light. Luke turned his face to the wall until she left. All right, so no questions for you guys today. Socrative. What I want you to do, though, is there's this document here. It's called Overpopulation. All right, so this is a hyperlink. You can just click on it to open it. You're going to watch this video, and it's about how the world sees overpopulation and if it's a problem or not. And it explains how population works in our country. Okay? So you're going to watch that, and you're going to answer these 4 questions and turn them in. All right, talk to you later.